Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me for my little talk about the economics of Ethereum scaling solutions. So what do I want to do? I want to give you kind of a quick overview of, let's say, the layer 2, layer 3 space out there, and then really talk about a couple of metrics where we can really measure how are these layer 2s doing and why are they there, and why should we actually look at data to kind of make better decisions as well. So a bit of a background. I'm Tobias. I'm a product designer, and so I worked a long time as a product designer. And at Grow the Pie, I do design, business dev, and communications. But a lot of my work really is around design, and also we heard it in the previous talk with Jessica. It's about finding, empathy and really understanding users and how can we abstract away from tech and make stuff understandable in a very human way. And I think that's what Grow the Pie is also trying to do. Grow the Pie is let's say, a data platform that is analyzing different Ethereum scaling solutions and literally kind of providing fundamental metrics like activity metrics, economic metrics, also around value locked, but also convenience metrics like transaction costs. And a big part of our work is labeling smart contracts. And by labeling smart contracts, we can assign different categories to the block space usage, right? So we can really understand, okay, what are people doing on these different layer 2s that are launching out there, right? And when we look at like a great project that's called L2Beats that does a lot of risk analysis and really kind of analyzes these layer 2s, layer 3s once they launch from a very security and technical perspective, we actually see there's around 158 plus active layer 2, layer 3 projects out there right now, which means, as you see, there's layer 2 projects that are already being listed and kind of risk assessed, but there's upcoming projects, and we already have archive projects, right? So that means projects like the Public Goods Network, for example, is already in a way archived because it's shutting down, because Gitcoin kind of, said it's actually not sustainable to run this network anymore, right? And so we are basically, our process always looks like that L2Beat does risk assessment and has also really kind of good metrics around total value locked, which we get from L2Beat, for example, but also around activity, and we kind of take it on from there. So we're trying to build a complementary product to that, saying what's the actual usage around these different layer 2s, layer 3s. And I want to do a quick flashback to DEF CON 2022 in Bogota. And we also said, how do we really onboard the next billion people to the Ethereum ecosystem? And we still haven't solved that because we actually don't get many more users in right now. We're all kind of still here and trying to find our way. And but we said back then, we need to scale, we need to be cheap, and we need better UX, right? And so how do we really make sense of all of this when all these layer 2s are launching and the market gets more and more crowded, and there's now layer 3s, and we have different users, different builders, and so where should they actually be and where should they navigate? But for that, we also really need to look at other industries, how they actually do it, because it might sound very abstract to kind of say, look, assessing economics and assessing all these layer 2s. So how do different other industries do that? And first of all, why are these scaling solutions actually important? And why is it maybe a good thing that we have that many in the future? We're talking a different panel talks about 100, 1,000 different layer 2s, layer 3s running on Ethereum. So why is it actually important? And when we look at 3 fields in outside of crypto, we can look at cloud computing, telecommunications, transportation. And when you actually think about it, we as normal people, we're also trying to assess these different value propositions that we have in each of these industries as well, right? Like in cloud computing, if I want to do some storage or computing, I also kind of try to compare AWS with Google, right? And then see, okay, who's cheaper actually. Telecommunications. Like really important metric is, okay, do they actually have signal, right? Where we're trying to be, like if you want, I don't know, like Orange here in Belgium, or if you want a different provider, we also have different metrics where we as normal users can also kind of assess, okay, where should we actually be? And transportation as well, if we want to go from place A to place B, we're also looking at Google Maps, right? And we have different options in terms of roads. There might be roads with tolls, there might be free roads, and then we kind of navigate our way through. And I think that's very important for in our space as well, but we need to make it understandable, right? If you only talk always about the tech, like optimistic rollups, CK rollups, then state chance plasma, and one important is actually missing, validiums, then like we also just need to look beyond that as well, because we won't have like always just technical people, right? We're like right now we're always talking in a very technical sense around this, but really kind of onboarding the next billion users, what we just said at DEF CON, also requires us really to kind of look beyond that. And I don't know, how familiar are you with all these different layer 2 technologies? Like, pretty much. Okay, don't need to go into detail about that. But what's really important is that we have a couple of different metrics where we could look at how to kind of really assess these scaling solutions. And I picked a couple to really focus on for today, and I'm also going to kind of show you a couple of examples later on to really kind of make sure we're all talking about the same thing and talking about like really understanding, okay, what are these metrics that we can look at. And one of them is transaction throughput, actually. Like you might want to look at like TPS right now, which is also valid, like transactions per second, right? So when you kind of go, like for example, on L2Beat right now, and you see like, okay, how are these different layer 2s are actually, how they're performing in terms of transactions per second. So how many transactions do they actually push through? But then also, it becomes a problem if you have different tech, what we just saw in the previous slide, and then you might not be able to actually compare them pretty well because we don't have standardized metrics. And also, one issue might be that you actually have like different chains that have like by design higher transactions per second because there might be a gaming chain, right? And if we played World of Warcraft, we know for each interaction, if we then had that on chain, of course, it's a like massive amount of transactions, right? But then we can also look at fees paid by users, or let's say revenue. So how much do actually users pay on these layer 2s and layer 3s on these scaling solutions? We'll get into that in a bit. And then also, of course, we have to look on the other side as well, on the cost side. So like settlement and DA costs. We're going to have a really interesting example. But basically, it always means, okay, we need to look at where is the data availability. We're here at the Modular Summit, right? And Celestia is one of the sponsors. So you could choose like an alternative data availability provider, right? Which might make it a bit cheaper to kind of really interact on a specific layer 2, let's say a Validium like Immutable X or Mantle, for example, or Manta Pacific in this case is a good example as well. But also, you might want to see, okay, what does Ethereum actually do in this development? And we recently saw with an upgrade, EIP 4844, that there is work being done, but it's also still an experimental space, and we'll see that in a bit. And of course, then we have like always these trade-offs between security, decentralization, but we also, of course, want to and need to scale these solutions. So that's why I want to go into a couple of different examples, really to kind of paint the picture a bit more clearly of like how can we actually do that. So we talked about throughput, and whoever like here had looked at throughput, a throughput metric for scaling solutions. Okay, I see the familiar faces, of course. So I'm gonna try to explain that a bit. Like I don't have a legend here, but let's say I mean. The blue part is space, right? So it's a chain that builds on the optimism stack, and it's part of the super chain. And then we have like OP mainnet itself, and then you see, okay, look, there's actually a very flat line, right? like for example for optimism. So that means optimism is actually right now always, and almost always, like not here at that dip, at capacity, running at capacity. So that already kind of means, okay, what can you do? Like optimism could say, okay, we're upgrading our own chain, right? And then we have a higher throughput, so a higher capacity to actually, have more transactions per second going through the layer 2. And that's actually what also Base did. You see these steps, what they did. But they also have to make sure as well that they actually can still run at this higher throughput, which is an interesting metric, because here, like this light blue line, that's actually linear. And you see linear had its peak. I think they did an experiment with Linear Park, for example, and then they had a lot of transactions all of a sudden, which is interesting then, because you see linear can actually operate at a totally different capacity, which then might be interesting to you if you really want to look at okay, which chain actually has the potential to actually have more users, right? And not actually then have higher fees because it's congested again, right? Because we always we're building all these solutions around in the scaling space, because we want to keep fees low and we want to still be able to transact really fast. And so linear actually has a lot of bandwidth until 10 megagas per second, for example. And now, coming to a different metric, and we talked about fees, EIP 4844. Who's familiar with EIP 4844? Okay, roughly. So basically, Ethereum had an upgrade and introduced so-called blobs. So short story is that basically now you can also use so-called blobs for fees to say, look, we don't store the data forever, what call data does, but we just store it for, let's say, 2 weeks. And then that data, because it's not that important to actually store it forever, we get rid of it again. Allows us that we can actually have cheaper fees on the scaling solutions. So we saw that, it was, I think, in March at some point. You see that red line. And before that, that was all the fees, pretty high. The median fee to transact was sometimes I think that is Blast or Scroll at 200 cents, so $2 per median transaction, right? And then all of a sudden it dropped, and you see we're now down here, and slowly all the other layer 2s actually got there as well when they did their upgrade to support blobs actually. And now everyone's saying we're talking about economics, right? Okay, so they still have to run their own chain, right? They have operating cost. So if we now actually get the fees down, do we actually still make money? And that's actually quite interesting in Base's on-chain profit, if you look at that. Because Base, literally on, for example, the 26th of March, made $2.3 million in on-chain profit just on that day. So that means once you have enough users, and again, enough throughput, Base can actually then kind of accommodate for many more transactions and can, even though the fees are cheap, make a good profit, right? And, but yeah, then there's June 20th. And on June 20th, there was an event which was a blob congestion, basically. So it was in a nutshell, it was that there was this layer 0 airdrop, and basically people could claim that on Arbitrum. And Arbitrum had quite an efficient way to actually deal with these transactions. So for example, fees paid by users, on that day as well, users in total paid 3.4 million in fees to Arbitrum just on that day. So they made quite some money. But also the fees spiked on Arbitrum, right? So sometimes people actually then paid, for example, $12 for a transaction again, and that's what we wanted to get rid of, right? That's why we have layer 2s to actually not have these expensive fees anymore. But at the same time, we also saw something else. Because the on-chain profit, I mean, for Arbitrum was very high, but for Base, that on 26th of March made more than 2 million in on-chain profit, all of a sudden at minus 180,000, right? So on that day, they lost $180,000. And now the question is, why did that happen, right? And so right now the situation is like that. We have when using blobs, we actually have a separate fee market. So basically, then like all of these layer 2s, then all of like by default basically used blobs, but they also overpaid in that moment, right? Because they could have used call data, for example, because in that moment there was a delay with the badger as well for some chains, and all of a sudden they couldn't post the data to L1 at the price that they actually gave to the users. So that's why the on-chain profit then dropped for these individual layer 2s. For example, Linear, not so much, because Linear had like a different mechanism. They were like sometimes waiting to actually post in the data to L1, so they could keep the fees low on that day for the users, and then just waited until the market cooled down and then was cheap again. All right. And we actually see, and that's a chart by Hildobby and Dune, we actually see that blobs are not being used that much at the moment, right? They're not at, like the target of the blob usage is always kind of is here right now, but we almost never reach that. So that's why that also gives us an indication, look, actually right now there's not that many or not enough users actually using the layer 2s, so that we can efficiently make use of blobs or alternative DA, for example. And that again is the example when it actually spiked on that day, June 20th, and other layer 2s like Mantle, for example, had then like still 1 cent because they were not affected by that because they're not using blobs, right? They are using Celestia as a data availability provider. So basically, summary of that is that we can look at all these different metrics, and we also need to know some parts of the tech stack right now to really estimate. Okay, look, what does it actually mean when I use the specific layer 2, when I use a specific layer 3, and also, of course, is there a data availability provider that might also make this more efficient, this whole story, right? And that's the whole point where we say, look, we as Grow the Pie also believe in like a multiple, let's say, like a world where users can literally choose their different layer 2s, layer 3s, and there will be like very purpose-built layer 2s, layer 3s, whatever stack you use. If you're using Arbitrum Orbit, if you're using kind of the OP stack with the superchain, but we need to make it like so that people can actually navigate this whole space, right? So really kind of bringing the user that also is not a data expert kind of closer to this whole ecosystem and kind of presenting like sensible data that's easy to understand, and also kind of brings them, let's say, light into this darkness of like, I don't know, this forest of all these different scaling solutions. And we need the standardized metrics to really compare across different stacks. So I think that's very important to see. Look, we cannot sometimes compare apples and pears, right? It's kind of, sometimes you really need like different data metrics and charts to really make this more understandable. And so yeah, that's our view on that, and hopefully some of these examples helped you to understand kind of how to use these metrics, and then kind of really analyze for yourself where should you be in the future as but when using or when building on different layer 2s or layer 3s. That's it. Thank you very much, and please follow us.